So today we're going to be looking at some pins and identifying whether they're absolute or relative, and if we're going to be identifying the pinned piece, the pinning piece, and the piece behind the pinned piece. If you haven't already, I suggest that you go check out the pins lesson video so that you can learn about pins. That being said, let's get started. So this is the answer to last week's puzzle where you were asked to identify what's the pinned piece, the pinning piece, and the piece behind the pinned piece, and whether it was absolute or relative. So the answer to that is the queen on f3 is pinning the f4 knight to the f8 king, and it is an absolute pin because the piece behind the pinned piece is a king. Therefore, the knight is not allowed to move. As well as that, there is another pin in the position, and if you found both pins, great job. It's the queen on b6 is pinning the b3 pawn to the b1 king. Even though the pawn can't capture anything right now, if he could capture something, then he wouldn't be able to, since this is an absolute pin because the piece behind the pin piece is a king, the king on b1, and it's an absolute pin, and you can't move the piece unless it's on that same line of attack if it's an absolute pin. If it's a relative, then be my guest, move it, but it's not usually recommended. So, let's get started. So, you'll have 30 seconds to find out the pinned piece, the pinning piece, and the piece behind the pinned piece. White is pinning black in this position. So, you have 30 seconds starting now. Time is up. The e4 queen is pinning the c6 knight to the b7 king. This is an absolute pin because the piece behind the pin piece is the king on b7, and since it's a king, this is absolute and the knight can never move unless the queen or the king moves to a square that is not continuing to pin the knight. For example, if the king moved to b8, c8, or c7, the queen would not be indirectly attacking the king, therefore the knight can move. And if the queen moved anywhere except for d5 and f3, but the queen's probably not going to move to d5 or f3, then the knight would be free from the pin. But right now the knight is not free from the pin, so he can't move. This is an absolute pin, just to summarize. And now that we've identified the pin, let's move on to the next puzzle. So this is a position where black is pinning white 2 times. I want you to try and find the pin, at least one pin out of the 2 pins, and you have 30 seconds starting now. Time is up. So one of the pins is the d4 queen is pinning the d3 knight to the d2 queen. And this is a relative pin because the piece behind the pin piece is not a king, it's a queen in this case. And the other pin is the a5 bishop is pinning the c3 knight to the d2 queen. This is also a relative pin because the queen, the piece behind the pin piece, is not a king. It's a queen in this case. If you found at least one of those pins, good job. If you found both of those pins, great job. And if you had to pause the video, that's okay. Alright, let's move on to the next puzzle. So in this puzzle, black is pinning white in one place. There's only one pin. And I want you to find that pin and tell me whether it's absolute or relative. You have 30 seconds starting now. Time is up. The f2 queen is pinning the g2 pawn to the h2 king. This is an absolute pin because the piece behind the pinned piece is a king, the king on a2. So, now that we know that it's an absolute pin and the f2 queen is pinning the g2 pawn to the h2 king, let's move on to the next puzzle. So, in this puzzle, white is pinning black somewhere, and black is pinning white somewhere. I want you to try and find at least one of the pins. You have 30 seconds starting now. Time is up. So, the pin that white is pinning to black is that d8 queen is pinning the e8 knight to the g8 king. This is an absolute pin because the piece behind the pinned piece is a king. The other pin is the e4 queen pinning the f3 knight to the g2 king. This is an absolute pin because the piece behind the pinned piece is a king, the king on g2. So, let's move on to our next puzzle. So, in this position, black is pinning white, and you have 30 seconds to find it, starting now. Time is up. The correct answer was the b2 rook is pinning the c2 knight to the f2 rook, and this is a relative pin because the piece behind the pin piece is not a king and it's a rook. I never said that the piece behind the pin piece has to be either a king or a queen. It can be anything. A rook, a king, a queen, a bishop, a knight. Maybe not a pawn, but it could be a pawn. behind a pawn and the one in the front is being attacked, it could happen in some endgames. Well, that's more of a double attack, like. But aside from that, this is definitely a pin. Most definitely, it is a pin. So this is a relative pin, just to summarize. And let's move on to our next puzzle. So in this puzzle, black is pinning white 2 times. I want you to try and find at least one of the pins. You have 30 seconds starting now. Time is up. One pin is the G7 queen pinning the G3 pawn to the G1 king. This is an absolute pin because the piece behind the pinned piece is the king on G1. The bishop on D4 is also pinning a pawn to the king. The bishop on D4 is pinning the F2 pawn to the G1 king. This is also an absolute pin because the piece behind the pinned piece is the same king. So if you found one of those pins, then good job. And if you found both the pins, great job. Remember, there's no shame in pausing the videos if you need more time. So, now it's your turn. I want you to try and find the pin. Black is pinning white, and I want you to try and see how. So, I'll tell you the answer to this in the next video, and I'll see you next time. And I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any feedback, you can post it in the comments of the video or post it in the form in the description. And the form is anonymous, so I won't know who filled it out. Please hit that like button and subscribe for more videos. And you can visit the chess playlist if you want to see more chess videos. That's where I store all the chess videos. And I really hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.